Pull out a dollar bill from your wallet and stare at it for a moment. Look at the green ink and the face of George Washington. Read the words printed at the top, Federal Reserve Note. Most people believe this piece of paper has value because America is powerful. They think the dollar is backed by gold bars sitting in Fort Knox. They think it is the world reserve currency because of military might or economic strength. That is a comforting lie. The real reason your money has value is not because of gold or guns. It is because of a secret deal signed in a desert over 50 years ago. It is a deal written in blood and oil. A deal that rigged the global financial system and forced every nation on earth to bow to the American Central Bank. This is the story of the petrodollar. This is the story of how one nation was facing total economic collapse, and how one man made a secret trip to save an empire by enslaving the world. Before we go to that desert, we need to go back to the world as it existed after the Second World War. America stood alone as the financial superpower of the planet. While Europe was rebuilding from rubble and Asia was still reeling from devastation, the United States held more than half of the world's gold reserves. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations met in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. They were there to design a new global financial order. The agreement they signed changed everything. Under the Bretton Woods system, the U.S. dollar became the only currency in the world directly backed by gold. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar. If France or Japan or Britain wanted to trade internationally, they had to do it in dollars. And if those countries ever doubted the value of the dollar, they could take their paper bills to the U.S. Treasury and exchange them for physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This made the dollar as good as gold. It was a brilliant move. The United States had effectively turned its currency into the global standard. The world needed dollars to trade, and America controlled the printing press. For 2 decades, this system held the world together. The American economy boomed. Europe rebuilt itself using American loans. Japan rose from the ashes with American capital. But by the late 1960s, cracks started to appear. The United States was spending money it did not have. The Vietnam War was costing billions every month. President Lyndon Johnson launched massive social programs called the Great Society. The government was funding wars abroad and welfare at home. They were printing more dollars than they had gold to back them up. The Treasury was creating money out of thin air. Other nations began to notice. France was the first to act. President Charles de Gaulle did not trust the Americans. He suspected that the United States was inflating its currency, that the gold vault was not as full as Washington claimed. In 1965, de Gaulle ordered the French central bank to convert their dollar reserves into gold. He sent warships across the Atlantic to collect French gold from the New York Federal Reserve. Other countries watched and followed. Germany demanded gold. Switzerland demanded gold. The gold reserves of the United States were bleeding out at an alarming rate. By 1971, the situation was critical. President Richard Nixon was trapped in a financial nightmare. The U.S. Treasury was running out of gold. If the bleeding continued, America would go bankrupt. The most powerful nation in history was about to face insolvency. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Nixon appeared on national television. He told the American people that he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He said it was to protect the dollar from speculators. But the word temporary was a lie. The decision was permanent. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency. It was no longer backed by gold or silver or anything tangible. It was backed only by a promise from a government that was already drowning in debt. The reaction was swift and brutal. The value of the dollar collapsed. Inflation exploded. The price of everything from bread to gasoline skyrocketed. Foreign governments panicked. They had been holding trillions of dollars in reserves, and now the paper was worth less every single day. The Bretton Woods system was dead. The global economy was in free fall. America was facing a crisis that threatened to end its dominance. If the world stopped using the dollar, the empire would crumble. The government needed a new plan. They needed to create a new reason for the world to want dollars. They needed to tie the dollar to something that every human being on earth could not live without. They needed something even more essential than gold. They found it in oil. But this solution would require a secret deal with a kingdom in the desert. A kingdom that controlled the largest oil reserves on the planet. A kingdom that was ruled by a family terrified of losing power. In October of 1973, the world was hit by the first major oil crisis. The Arab nations, led by Saudi Arabia, had decided to punish the West for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. They cut off oil exports. Within weeks, the price of oil quadrupled. Gas stations across America ran dry. People waited in lines for hours just to fill their tanks. Factories shut down because they had no fuel. The economies of Europe and Japan ground to a halt. The entire Western world was paralyzed. It was in this moment of chaos that Henry Kissinger saw an opportunity. Kissinger was the U.S. Secretary of State and one of the most ruthless strategic minds in modern history. He understood that the oil crisis was not just a problem, it was leverage. If the United States could control the flow of oil money, it could control the world. Kissinger devised a plan that was as brilliant as it was brutal. He would offer the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia a deal they could not refuse. In the summer of 1974, Kissinger and a small team of American officials made a secret journey to Riyadh. They met with King Faisal and the ruling members of the House of Saud. At that time, Saudi Arabia was a developing nation sitting on oceans of crude oil. But the kingdom was surrounded by enemies. The Soviet Union was spreading communism across the Middle East. Revolutionary movements threatened monarchies everywhere. Internal uprisings were a constant fear. The House of Saud was rich but vulnerable. Kissinger understood this fear. He played it like a master. He told the Saudi leadership that the United States would provide total military protection to the kingdom. America would sell them the most advanced weapons in the world. They would train the Saudi military. They would build bases and provide intelligence. The United States would guarantee that as long as America existed, the House of Saud would remain in power. It was a promise of eternal security, but the price was steep. The Saudis had to agree to two non-negotiable terms. First, Saudi Arabia had to price all of its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. No British pounds, no Japanese yen, no German marks, only dollars. If any country in the world wanted to buy Saudi oil, they had to first acquire American currency. Second, Saudi Arabia had to take the massive profits from oil sales and invest them back into the United States. They would buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This meant the Saudis would be lending their oil money directly to the American government to fund American debt. The House of Saud accepted the deal. They had no choice. The survival of their dynasty depended on American protection. By 1975, every other member of the OPEC cartel followed Saudi Arabia's lead. The petrodollar was born. Kissinger had pulled off a master stroke. He had replaced the gold standard with the oil standard. Think about what this meant for the rest of the world. Every nation on earth needed oil to power their factories and vehicles and militaries. Because oil was now sold only in dollars, every nation was forced to hold massive reserves of American currency. If Japan wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they had to first sell cars and electronics to earn dollars. If Germany wanted energy, they had to export machinery for dollars. This created permanent artificial demand for the U.S. dollar. No matter how much money the Federal Reserve printed, the world still needed dollars to buy energy. This was the ultimate economic weapon. The United States could now run unlimited budget deficits and print trillions of dollars without facing the normal consequences of inflation. Why? Because the inflation was exported to the rest of the world. Every time the Fed printed money, it was effectively taxing every human being on the planet who needed to buy oil. The cost of American excess was paid by foreign workers and foreign savers. The petrodollar turned the U.S. dollar into a tool of empire. It gave Washington the power to sanction and destroy any nation that disobeyed. If a country was cut off from the dollar system, they could not buy oil. If they could not buy oil, their economy would collapse. Their people would starve. Their military would be grounded. This was a silent and visible form of domination. The world was no longer ruled by the British Empire or the Spanish Armada. It was ruled by the ledger, by the balance sheet, by the control of currency. And the House of Saud became the enforcer of this system. The royal family was now the central bank's most important ally. They were rewarded handsomely. Billions of dollars flowed into Saudi Arabia. American contractors built cities in the desert. The Saudi elite became unimaginably wealthy, but they were also trapped. They had become dependent on American military protection. They had become prisoners of the deal. For 50 years, this system worked perfectly. It allowed the United States to consume far more than it produced. It funded the largest military in human history. It enabled the American middle class to enjoy cheap goods and low interest rates. The rest of the world paid the bill. Developing nations were crushed under the weight of dollar-denominated debt. Countries in Africa and Latin America borrowed dollars from the IMF and the World Bank to pay for oil and food. When the value of the dollar rose, their debts became unpayable. Entire nations were forced into austerity. Schools closed. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Currencies collapsed. But the American consumer kept shopping. The petrodollar was a free lunch that lasted half a century. It was the greatest financial heist in history. And most people never even knew it happened. But every empire eventually faces a reckoning. Every rigged system eventually breaks. The petrodollar system is now under attack. The world is waking up. The nations that were forced to play by American rules are tired of being used. The alliance between Washington and Riyadh is fraying. The trust that was built in the desert in 1974 is gone. The first crack in the system came from within the United States itself. The rise of hydraulic fracturing changed everything. By 2010, America had unlocked vast reserves of oil trapped in shale rock. Domestic production skyrocketed. The United States went from being the largest importer of oil to being one of the largest producers. America no longer needed Saudi oil. This changed the calculus of the secret deal. When the U.S. stopped buying Saudi crude, the Saudis lost leverage. Washington became less concerned with protecting the kingdom. The royal family in Riyadh began to feel abandoned. They watched as the Obama administration negotiated with Iran, their mortal enemy. They watched as American politicians criticized Saudi human rights abuses. The House of Saud realized that the umbrella of protection was no longer guaranteed. They began to look for new allies. They began to look east. China is now the largest buyer of Saudi oil. The Chinese economy is the engine of global growth. For decades, China was forced to use dollars to buy energy just like everyone else. But Beijing is no longer willing to accept that arrangement. China wants to trade in its own currency, the yuan. For the last several years, quiet negotiations have been taking place between Beijing and Riyadh. They are discussing the one thing that was forbidden in the 1974 agreement. They are discussing selling oil in yuan. If Saudi Arabia begins accepting other currencies for oil, the petrodollar dies. The artificial demand for dollars evaporates. Countries will no longer need to hoard American currency. They will begin selling their U.S. Treasury bonds. Trillions of dollars will flood back into the United States, causing catastrophic inflation. This is why the Middle East has been soaked in blood for decades. The wars were never about democracy or freedom. They were about protecting the petrodollar. Consider the case of Saddam Hussein. In November of 2000, Iraq announced it would no longer accept dollars for oil. Saddam wanted to be paid in euros. He called the dollar the currency of the enemy. The decision was symbolic, but dangerous. It threatened the foundation of American financial power. In March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. Saddam was toppled and eventually executed. One of the first acts of the new Iraqi government was to switch oil sales back to dollars. The message was clear. Any leader who challenges the dollar will be destroyed. Look at Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He proposed the creation of a gold-backed African currency called the dinar. He wanted African nations to sell oil and resources without using dollars. Gaddafi had the gold reserves and the political will to make it happen. In 2011, NATO launched a bombing campaign against Libya. Gaddafi was killed in the desert by rebels backed by Western intelligence. His plan for an African currency died with him. The petrodollar is defended by the barrel of a gun. But military force can only delay the inevitable. The global balance of power is shifting. The rise of the BRICS nations is accelerating the collapse of the dollar system. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa represent nearly half of the world's population. These countries are building alternative payment systems. They are creating new financial infrastructure that bypasses the dollar. They are doing this because they have learned a hard lesson. When the United States froze Russia's foreign currency reserves after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it sent shockwaves through every capital on Earth. Central banks around the world realized that their savings held in dollars could be confiscated at any moment. If they defied Washington, their national wealth could be erased with the stroke of a pen. This realization has accelerated de-dollarization. Countries are now buying gold at record levels. They are signing trade agreements in local currencies. They are preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer king. Saudi Arabia is now a member of the BRICS organization. The kingdom is moving closer to China and Russia. They are publicly signaling that the era of American dominance is ending. The House of Saud knows that the United States cannot afford to lose them. If the Saudis walk away from the petrodollar, the entire system collapses. The royal family is using this leverage to extract concessions from Washington while simultaneously preparing to abandon the dollar. It is the ultimate betrayal. The student has learned from the master. The Saudis are now using the same cold calculation that Kissinger used 50 years ago. They are playing both sides. They are securing their survival in a multipolar world. And when the moment is right, they will make the final move. If the petrodollar collapses, America faces severe consequences. The power to print without cost would vanish, forcing harsh taxes and deep spending cuts. Imports would surge in price as the dollar weakens. Interest rates would jump, crushing mortgage, loans, and credit cards. Markets would crash as foreign money flees. Unemployment would rise, and living standards would fall. Few grasp how fragile this system is, built on a desert deal. For decades, America lived beyond its means. Now the bill is due. The petrodollar let the United States export inflation and import global wealth, financing wars and piling up trillions in debt. That debt cannot be paid, only inflated away, and when the world no longer needs dollars, inflation will return home. The secret deal of 1974 that crowned the dollar is becoming its trap. An empire built on oil and paper is running out of both. The world is shifting toward value earned, not printed. Gold is returning, central banks are hoarding it, and alternative currencies and digital assets are rising. The dollar's monopoly is fading as history is shaped by debt, resources, and those who control the ledger. Nations that produce real wealth rise. Those living on credit fall. The wheel is turning. New alliances form, rivals prepare, and old partners hedge. The signs are in everyday prices. A 50-year experiment is nearing its end. The bridge that carried America across the last century is collapsing. Sovereignty is solvency. Countries that control resources and make real goods will inherit the future. The desert deal bought decades of dominance, but left a burden the world will not forget. The reckoning is here. History will remember an empire undone by balance sheet.